The morning my husband Robert died, my daughter-in-law didn't ask how I was holding up. She asked when the will would be read. I remember that moment with a clarity that still surprises me. The soft Texas sunlight slipping through the kitchen blinds, the quiet hum of the refrigerator, and the strange stillness that settles over a house when someone who filled every room with life is suddenly gone. Robert Whitmore had been my husband for 42 years. A man who believed in early mornings, black coffee, and keeping his promises. When the doctor called just after 6 a.m., I felt the world tilt slightly, as if the ground itself had taken a careful step backward. Grief didn't arrive all at once. It came slowly, like a tide rising around my feet while I stood there holding the phone. Within hours, our home in Austin began to fill with people. Casseroles appearing on the counter, quiet voices drifting through the hallway, and neighbors who hugged me longer than usual. My son Daniel moved through the house with the stiff politeness of someone trying to stay strong, but Ashley, his wife, carried herself differently. She walked from room to room with a kind of determined energy, checking her phone, whispering things to Daniel near the back porch, and occasionally glancing at me as if measuring how much I understood. At one point, while the afternoon sun stretched across the dining table Robert had built with his own hands, Ashley stepped close and spoke softly, the way someone does when pretending to be considerate. She asked if I knew when Robert's lawyer might come by, and whether the paperwork would take long. I looked at her for a moment, noticing how quickly the question came, how naturally the word paperwork replaced the word grief. I simply told her that today was not a day for paperwork. She nodded politely, but I could see the impatience flicker across her face before it disappeared. What Ashley didn't know, what none of them knew, was that several months earlier, Robert and I had sat together on our back patio during a warm spring evening and talked quietly about the future. The sky had been turning pink above the oak trees, and Robert had reached for my hand with the same calm certainty he'd always had. That was the night he told me about the decision he had made regarding the inheritance, a decision involving $28 million and one small condition that would reveal far more about our family than anyone expected. He had looked at me carefully and said, "Margaret, promise me something. Promise me you won't tell them right away. Let things unfold the way they choose to." I promised him I would. So on the day my husband passed away, as my daughter-in-law quietly tried to steer conversations toward lawyers and documents, I said nothing about the $28 million, and I certainly said nothing about the truth Robert had hidden inside his will. The house grew quieter as the evening settled over Austin, but the kind of quiet that filled the rooms was not peaceful. It was the heavy silence that comes when people are waiting for something they are too polite to say out loud. I sat at the kitchen table long after most of the neighbors had gone home, staring at the same cup of coffee that had grown cold hours earlier. Across the room Daniel and Ashley stood near the living room window, their voices lowered but not quite low enough. I had spent 42 years in that house and I knew the sound of whispers better than they realized. Daniel sounded tired, the way a son sounds when he is trying to carry grief and responsibility at the same time, but Ashley sounded different. Her voice had a certain brightness to it, almost like someone planning a trip instead of attending a funeral. I heard her mention the lawyer again, carefully at first, then more directly, asking Daniel if he knew when the will might be reviewed and whether his father had left clear instructions about the estate. Daniel told her that it was too soon to talk about that and that his father had only been gone a few hours, but Ashley gently insisted that these things were practical matters and that families always handled them quickly. I kept my eyes on the table and said nothing. A few minutes later she walked into the kitchen carrying 2 glasses of water, and offered me one with a sympathetic smile that did not quite reach her eyes. She asked if I needed anything, and whether someone had already contacted Robert's attorney. I thanked her politely and told her that everything would be handled in time. She nodded again. But there was a brief pause, the kind that happens when someone is deciding whether to push a little further. She mentioned that estates of Robert's size could be complicated, and that sometimes it helped when the family understood what to expect early on. I could hear the careful way she chose her words, as if she were testing the ground beneath her feet. What Ashley did not know was that I had already walked that ground months earlier. Robert and I had spent an entire afternoon in his study reviewing documents with our attorney, a thoughtful man named Charles Bennett who had been helping our family for nearly 15 years. I remembered the way Robert leaned back in his chair that day, his hands folded calmly in his lap, explaining exactly how he wanted things arranged. When the meeting ended, Charles had looked at me with a quiet expression and asked if I was comfortable with the decision. I told him that I trusted my husband completely. Now, sitting at the same kitchen table where Robert and I had shared thousands of ordinary mornings, I watched Ashley glance toward the hallway where Daniel had stepped away to answer a phone call. For just a moment her polite mask slipped and I saw something else beneath it. Something sharper, something impatient. Then Daniel returned and she softened again, placing a gentle hand on his arm and speaking about funeral arrangements as if that had been her only concern all along. I lowered my eyes to the cup of coffee again and reminded myself of the promise I had made on that quiet spring evening. Robert had known exactly what he was doing, and the truth he left behind was patient. Could wait a little longer. The next morning arrived with a pale gray sky hanging over Austin and a quiet that felt heavier than the day before. I woke earlier than usual, long before the sun reached the tall oak trees in our backyard, and for a moment I forgot what had happened. Then I noticed the empty side of the bed and remembered that Robert would never again wake before me to grind coffee beans, and read the morning paper at the kitchen counter. I walked slowly down the hallway, the wooden floor creaking softly under my steps, and the house felt larger than it ever had. Grief has a strange way of stretching space. Every room seemed to echo with memories, but there was also a new tension in the air. Something subtle yet unmistakable. When I reached the kitchen I found Ashley already there, standing by the counter with her phone pressed to her ear. She had not noticed me yet, and her voice carried more clearly than she intended. She spoke quickly, almost excitedly, explaining to someone that Robert had passed away the previous morning, and that the family would soon be reviewing the estate documents. I heard her mention the number $28 million in a careful whisper, the way people do when speaking about money they believe will soon belong to them. She said that once the will was read things would finally become clear, and that she expected the process to move quickly. I remained in the hallway for a moment, listening quietly, not out of curiosity but because the truth sometimes reveals itself when people think no one is nearby. When Ashley finally ended the call she turned and saw me standing there. For just a brief second her expression changed, the brightness fading before she quickly replaced it with a gentle smile. She asked if I had slept at all and offered to make breakfast. I thanked her and told her that a cup of coffee would be enough. As she prepared it she spoke about practical matters again, mentioning funeral arrangements, guest lists and travel plans for relatives who might attend the service. Her tone was calm, almost professional, as though she had already stepped into the role of organizing everything that remained of Robert's life. Daniel came into the kitchen a few minutes later, still wearing the same tired expression he had carried since the hospital called. He wrapped his arms around me and said that he would take care of everything, that I should focus on resting and remembering the good years I had shared with his father. I placed my hand on his shoulder and told him that was very kind of him. While he poured himself coffee, Ashley asked gently whether Robert had ever mentioned when his attorney might contact the family, explaining that sometimes estates required timely decisions. Daniel told her again that it was too soon to think about those things, but she simply nodded and said she understood. I sat quietly at the table watching the two of them move through the kitchen that Robert and I had built our lives in. They believed they were preparing for the next chapter of their future, but they did not yet understand that Robert had already written that chapter himself. The promise I made to him remained clear in my mind, and the truth he had placed inside that will was waiting patiently for the moment it would finally be heard. I spent the rest of that morning moving slowly through the house, touching small familiar things the way people do when they are trying to understand that life has quietly changed forever. Robert had always believed that ordinary routines kept a person grounded, so I brewed coffee the same way he used to, measuring the grounds carefully and waiting for the soft gurgling sound of the machine finishing its work. The smell filled the kitchen, warm and comforting, but it also carried memories of thousands of quiet mornings we had shared together. Daniel eventually left to meet with the funeral home director across town, promising that he would handle the arrangements and that I should not worry about anything. I thanked him because that was what a mother does, even when she knows the situation is more complicated than it appears. Once he was gone, the house felt different again. Ashley moved through the rooms with a quiet determination, occasionally checking her phone or stepping outside to make another call. She tried to keep her voice soft, but a large house like ours has a way of carrying sound down the hallway when doors are only half closed. Around midday I stepped out onto the back patio for a few minutes of fresh air. The warm Texas breeze moved gently through the oak branches above the yard. And for a moment I remembered the evening Robert and I had sat in those same chairs discussing the future he had already planned so carefully. We had watched the sun sink behind the fence while the sky turned shades of gold and pale orange. Robert had always been a thoughtful man. Someone who believed that time reveals the truth about people more clearly than words ever could. That was why he had insisted on the arrangement he made with our attorney. He wanted to give everyone the opportunity to show exactly who they were. When I returned to the kitchen, Ashley was once again speaking on the phone, her tone low but confident. She was explaining that the family estate included several properties, a company investment Robert had built over decades, and savings that together were worth more than $28 million. She spoke about it with the careful excitement of someone already imagining the possibilities ahead. I quietly opened the refrigerator and poured myself a glass of iced tea, while she continued describing what she believed would soon belong to Daniel and her. When she noticed me standing there, she ended the call quickly and asked if I needed anything from the grocery store, or if I wanted her to order lunch. I told her that I was fine and that there was plenty of food already in the house. She nodded and then casually mentioned that sometimes attorneys preferred to review estate documents within a few days, so that families could begin planning their financial responsibilities. I simply smiled and told her that Robert had always believed in careful timing. Ashley seemed satisfied with that answer, but I could see the curiosity behind her polite expression. She believed that the future of our family fortune would be decided very soon. What she did not realize was that Robert had already decided exactly when the truth would come forward. And until that moment arrived, I intended to keep my promise and say nothing at all. The following day unfolded slowly, as if time itself had decided to move with careful steps through our home. By late afternoon, the living room had begun to fill with quiet preparations for the days ahead. A few close friends stopped by with flowers and warm casseroles, placing them gently on the kitchen counter the way neighbors in Austin have done for generations when someone in the community passes away. Daniel returned from his meeting with the funeral director looking exhausted but determined, carrying a folder of documents and speaking softly about service times and guest arrangements. He explained that the memorial would likely be held in 2 days at the small chapel Robert had always respected on the north side of town. I listened patiently, nodding when appropriate, grateful for Daniel's effort to honor his father in a thoughtful way. Ashley sat beside him on the sofa, her posture attentive, occasionally offering suggestions about guest lists or reception details. On the surface she appeared supportive and organized, but there was an energy behind her calm expression that reminded me of someone waiting for a long-anticipated announcement. Later that evening the house quieted again once the visitors had gone. Daniel stepped outside to make another phone call, while Ashley remained in the living room reviewing something on her tablet. I walked slowly toward Robert's study, a room that still carried the faint scent of the cedarwood shelves he had installed years ago. Inside that room were decades of careful planning, business documents, and personal notes that reflected the steady life he had built. I did not open any drawers because I already knew what had been arranged. Instead, I sat in his chair for a moment and allowed myself to remember the afternoon when he first explained everything to me. He had spoken calmly, the way he always did when discussing important decisions, telling me that money had a strange ability to reveal character. He believed that patience allowed the truth to rise naturally, without arguments or accusations. That was why he had insisted the details remain private until the proper moment. As I sat there in the quiet study, I could hear Ashley's voice drifting faintly from the hallway where she had begun speaking on the phone again. Her tone was softer now but still filled with a certain confidence. She mentioned that the attorney would probably contact the family soon, and that once the estate was formally reviewed things would become much clearer. I closed my eyes for a brief moment and remembered Robert's words from that spring evening on the patio. He had smiled gently and told me that the real test of a person is not how they behave when everything is comfortable, but how they behave when they believe a great reward is waiting for them. When I returned to the living room, Ashley ended her call and looked up with that same polite smile she had practiced so well. She asked if I needed anything before the evening ended and suggested that tomorrow might be a good day to speak with Robert's attorney, so that the family could begin understanding the estate. I simply thanked her for her concern and told her that Robert had always trusted the right moment to reveal important things. Ashley nodded slowly, perhaps believing that moment would arrive very soon. What she did not understand yet was that Robert had already chosen exactly when that moment would come, and when it did, the truth inside his will would speak far more clearly than any of us ever could. The day of Robert's memorial service arrived with a warm Texas morning and a quiet blue sky that stretched endlessly above the chapel on the north side of Austin. Daniel had chosen the small stone building because it was a place Robert respected, simple and dignified, the kind of place where people spoke honestly about the lives they remembered. I sat in the front row as friends, neighbors, and former colleagues slowly filled the wooden benches behind us. Many of them had known Robert for decades, and their voices carried gentle stories about the businesses he built, the community projects he supported, and the quiet generosity he never felt the need to announce. Daniel stood near the entrance greeting people with a tired but grateful smile, while Ashley moved carefully through the room making sure everyone felt welcomed. She wore a calm expression, the kind that suggested sympathy and patience, but I noticed how often her eyes moved around the room as if measuring something invisible. After the service ended, we gathered at a nearby reception hall where long tables had been arranged with coffee, sandwiches, and small plates of food that neighbors had brought earlier that morning. Conversations drifted from one corner of the room to another, stories about Robert mixing with quiet laughter as people remembered the man he had been. For a moment I allowed myself to feel grateful that his life had touched so many people in meaningful ways. Daniel stayed close to me, introducing me to several former business partners who shared kind memories of Robert's early days building the company from a small office downtown. Ashley stood nearby speaking with a few distant relatives, her tone warm and attentive. Yet even during those gentle conversations I noticed the same pattern from the past few days. Whenever someone mentioned Robert's business success or the size of the estate he had built over the years, Ashley listened very carefully. Once, while Daniel stepped away to thank an old friend, she leaned slightly toward another relative and mentioned that the family would soon meet with Robert's attorney to review the estate documents. Her voice remained polite and respectful, but there was a quiet excitement behind the words that only someone watching closely would notice. Later in the afternoon, the guests gradually began to leave, offering final hugs and condolences before returning to their own lives. The room slowly emptied until only a few close family members remained. Daniel sat beside me looking both relieved and exhausted, telling me that his father would have appreciated the simple service and the honest memories shared by everyone who attended. Ashley joined us at the table and spoke gently about the coming week, mentioning that the family would probably hear from the attorney soon regarding the will. Daniel nodded thoughtfully and said that he expected a call within a few days. I listened quietly, remembering once again the conversation Robert and I had shared months earlier under the evening sky on our back patio. He had told me that patience reveals truth better than confrontation ever could. As we drove home later that evening, the sun was setting over the Texas hills, casting long golden light across the road ahead. Ashley spoke softly about practical matters waiting for the family in the coming days, but I remained silent beside the window. The truth Robert placed inside his will was still waiting for the right moment, and that moment was moving closer with every passing day. The house felt different after the memorial service, quieter in a way that made every sound stand out more clearly. The ticking clock in the hallway seemed louder than usual, and even the breeze outside carried through the oak branches with a slow, thoughtful rhythm. The following morning, Daniel sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, staring down at his phone as if expecting it to ring at any moment. Ashley moved around the kitchen preparing breakfast, but her attention drifted constantly toward Daniel, waiting for the same thing he was. I sat across from them and watched the early sunlight move across the wooden floor, remembering the thousands of ordinary mornings Robert and I had shared in that same room. Daniel finally looked up and said that he expected Robert's attorney would probably call soon to schedule the reading of the will. His voice was calm, but there was a quiet tension beneath it, the kind that comes when someone is about to learn something that might change their future. Ashley nodded and said that it would be good to understand everything clearly, so the family could plan responsibly. She spoke carefully, as though she were rehearsing the words she wanted to sound reasonable. Around mid-morning, Daniel's phone finally rang. The name on the screen was Charles Bennett, the attorney who had handled Robert's legal affairs for many years. Daniel answered the call and stepped into the hallway for privacy, but in a quiet house even a private conversation can sometimes be partially heard. I could not make out every word, yet I heard enough to understand the purpose of the call. Charles had asked that the immediate family come to his office the following afternoon so that he could formally read Robert's will and explain the details of the estate. When Daniel returned to the kitchen, he explained the plan in a steady voice. Ashley listened closely, her eyes focused and alert in a way that reminded me of someone preparing for an important announcement. She asked a few polite questions about the timing and whether anyone else would attend, and Daniel told her that it would likely be just the three of us along with the attorney. The rest of the day passed slowly as preparations were quietly made for the meeting. Daniel spent some time organizing Robert's remaining documents, while Ashley reviewed a few notes on her tablet and occasionally stepped outside to make phone calls. Each time she returned, her expression carried the same calm confidence she had shown all week. Late in the afternoon, she sat beside Daniel on the sofa and spoke gently about the future, mentioning that Robert had built an extraordinary legacy and that the family now had an opportunity to continue it. Daniel agreed and said that his father would want the family to stay united and thoughtful about the responsibility they were inheriting. I listened quietly from my chair near the window, watching the fading sunlight stretch across the living room carpet. Neither of them realized how carefully Robert had arranged every detail of that inheritance months earlier. He had trusted that time would reveal the truth about people's intentions, and that truth was only one meeting away. As evening settled over Austin and the house grew quiet again, I thought about the promise I had made to Robert under the warm spring sky. Tomorrow we would sit inside Charles Bennett's office and listen to the words Robert had left behind. When that moment arrived, the truth he had prepared would finally speak for itself. The next afternoon, the sky above Austin was bright and clear as Daniel drove us across town to the office of Charles Bennett, the attorney who had worked beside Robert for nearly 15 years. The building stood on a quiet corner downtown, a modest brick structure that reflected the same practical style Robert always respected. When we stepped inside the reception area, the atmosphere was calm and professional, the kind of place where important decisions had been carefully documented for decades. Charles greeted us personally at the door of his office. He was a tall man with silver hair, and the steady voice of someone who understood that moments like this carried weight for every family involved. He shook Daniel's hand warmly, offered Ashley a polite welcome, and then turned to me with a quiet expression that held a trace of understanding. We sat together around a large wooden table while Charles organized several documents into a neat stack in front of him. The room was silent except for the soft sound of papers being arranged and the distant hum of traffic outside. Daniel leaned forward slightly in his chair, his hands folded together as he prepared to hear his father's final instructions. Ashley sat beside him with careful composure, her posture calm but attentive, the way someone sits when expecting news that may shape the future. Charles began by speaking about Robert's long career, the business he had built over decades, and the careful planning he had invested in protecting the family's estate. He explained that Robert had updated his will several months earlier after a thorough review of his assets and investments. The total value of the estate, including property, business holdings, and financial accounts, remained close to $28 million. As those words were spoken, I noticed Ashley shift slightly in her seat, her eyes moving briefly toward Daniel before returning to the attorney. Charles continued reading through several standard provisions, outlining charitable contributions Robert had arranged for community programs he believed in. Daniel nodded respectfully at each detail, clearly proud of the legacy his father had created. Ashley listened closely, occasionally glancing at the pages in front of the attorney as though trying to anticipate what might come next. Finally, Charles reached the portion of the document that addressed the remaining estate. His tone remained calm and precise as he explained that Robert had left the majority of his personal and financial assets under a specific arrangement that required careful explanation. The room grew even quieter as he paused for a moment before continuing. Daniel leaned forward slightly, his attention completely focused on the document being read. Ashley remained very still beside him, her polite expression fixed in place while she waited for the words she believed would confirm the future she had already imagined. I sat back in my chair and looked toward the window where afternoon sunlight stretched across the floor. Months earlier, Robert had told me that this moment would arrive exactly as it was meant to. Charles turned the next page slowly and adjusted his glasses before continuing with the section Robert had personally insisted remain clear and unmistakable. In that quiet office, the truth Robert had prepared was about to reveal itself. And when those final instructions were spoken, every person in the room would finally understand the decision he had made long before this day arrived. Charles Bennett adjusted the final page of the document and looked across the table with the calm professionalism he had carried throughout the meeting. His voice remained steady as he explained that Robert had structured the estate in a way that reflected both his financial wisdom and his understanding of family character. The majority of Robert's personal wealth, including the business investments, property holdings, and financial accounts that together represented nearly $28 million, had been placed into a protected family trust. Charles explained that the trust was created with one primary beneficiary and one guiding condition that Robert had written very clearly. Daniel listened closely, his brow slightly furrowed as he tried to understand the arrangement. Ashley sat beside him without moving, her attention fixed on every word the attorney spoke. Charles continued reading and explained that the trust would remain under the direct management of Margaret Whitmore, Robert's wife of 42 years, who had been named the sole trustee responsible for protecting the estate and distributing any future benefits according to Robert's written instructions. For a moment the room was completely silent. Daniel slowly turned his head toward me with a look of surprise, not anger but genuine confusion as he tried to understand what his father had decided. Ashley's expression remained composed, yet I could see the stillness behind her eyes as the reality of the arrangement settled in. Charles then read the final section that Robert had personally insisted be included. The document stated that any future inheritance from the trust would only be shared with family members who demonstrated patience, respect, and genuine care for one another during the difficult time following his passing. Robert had written that wealth should never become a reward for impatience or expectation, but rather a responsibility entrusted to those who valued family above financial gain. When Charles finished reading, he carefully placed the document back on the table and allowed the silence to remain for a moment. Daniel leaned back in his chair, absorbing the information slowly. Finally, he looked at me and asked quietly if I had known about this arrangement. I met his eyes and answered honestly that Robert had shared his decision with me months earlier. Ashley looked between us as if trying to understand when that conversation had taken place. I simply explained that Robert believed people reveal their true intentions over time, especially when they believe something valuable is waiting for them. Daniel nodded slowly, and although the news surprised him, there was no anger in his voice when he spoke again. He said that if his father trusted me to guide the future of the estate, then he would respect that decision. Ashley remained quiet beside him, her earlier confidence replaced by a thoughtful silence. As we left the attorney's office and stepped back into the warm Austin afternoon, I felt the same calm certainty Robert had carried when he first described his plan. He had not created the arrangement to punish anyone. He had created it to reveal the truth. And in the quiet moments that followed, it became clear that the truth had already begun to speak for itself.